Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're doing something really cool. We're stepping into an imaginary roundtable discussion that totally unpacks the psychology and the deep philosophy behind Madeline Miller's massive bestseller, Circe. We've got novelists, classicists, and even a psychiatrist pulling apart exactly how we interact with ancient myths today. So whether you're a hardcore mythology buff or just someone fascinated by how we tell stories about power and trauma, this is going to be an absolutely illuminating ride.
Here's our quick roadmap for the discussion. First up, myth versus modernity. Then we'll tackle trauma and the Scylla problem. Third, the cost of heroism. And finally, where to read the full analysis.
Right off the bat, this brings us to the central philosophical question of our source material, and it's a real hook. When we rewrite an ancient myth, are we actually discovering the Greeks, or are we just discovering ourselves? That's the big puzzle these experts are circling around. Are modern retellings unearthing something that was secretly there the whole time, or are they just a mirror reflecting our own 21st century values?
So let's get into Section 1, Myth versus Modernity. We really have to ask if Miller is recovering a lost ancient woman or, creating an entirely new modern one who just happens to wear an ancient name. Because there is a massive, stark contrast between Homer's original text and the modern novel. In Homer's Odyssey, Circe is mostly just a narrative function. She's an obstacle. She's magical, she's dangerous, but eventually helpful, and she exists entirely within Odysseus' journey. But Madeline Miller's Circe, completely different ballgame. She is a psychological subject. She's given a really relatable emotional biography, a whole history of family trauma, and this powerful drive toward personal autonomy. So basically, Homer gives us a function, while Miller gives us a psychology.
The author herself actually points out her intention to literally reverse the camera. As Miller puts it, what happens if Odysseus is an episode in Circe's story? It's a brilliant structural flip. Suddenly, the hero who has been the absolute gravitational center of the narrative for thousands of years is just a supporting character. He's essentially a complicated boyfriend in a woman's journey of self-discovery.
But we have to look at the other side. Classicist Mary Beard asks a really tough, piercing question here. She notes that we love to say we're giving women back their voices with these retellings, but she pushes back and asks, which woman? Beard's skepticism suggests that maybe, just maybe, we are projecting our own modern desires, like the whole therapeutic language of trauma and self-definition, onto an ancient mask. It's an absolutely crucial tension to keep in mind. Are we really hearing an ancient Greek woman, or just ourselves echoing back?
Moving on to Section 2, Trauma and the Scylla Problem.
Now we're transitioning into the really complex issue of feminist reclamation. We're looking at what happens when our empowered, traumatized heroine causes just indefensible harm to another woman. In the novel, Circe suffers intense humiliation and rejection, but when she finally gets her hands on magical power, she uses it to inflict unimaginable pain on a romantic rival, famously transforming the nymph Scylla into that hideous monster with 6 dog heads and 12 writhing tentacles. Psychiatrist Jean Shinoda Bolen points out a profound psychological danger here. An old wound can use newfound power to inflict pain on rivals. We always kind of want our heroines to be pure, right? But here, trauma generalizes into horrifying cruelty.
And that leads to this crucial point. Power does not automatically heal the wound that acquires it. Finding your voice and gaining agency doesn't just magically erase trauma, and it for sure doesn't guarantee moral virtue. Circe gains external capacity, magic, long before she develops any real internal freedom or moral wisdom.
This brilliantly illustrates the danger of narrative perspective. Mary Beard makes this striking observation. Imagine if we just slightly shifted the camera and read a novel called Scylla. Circe wouldn't be this empowered feminist icon at all. She would be the terrifying, vindictive villain who destroys another woman's body over a man. It perfectly shows how heavily a storyteller can manipulate our empathy simply by choosing who we spend the most time with.
And this is exactly why this matters to you as a reader. We have to understand the difference between compassion and absolution. True moral complexity means taking a character's suffering seriously without giving them a pass of permanent innocence. Modern storytelling has this kind of dangerous tendency to let a protagonist's trauma function as a complete moral excuse for cruelty, which effectively makes their victims disappear. The Roundtable argues that a mature reading holds Circe fully accountable for Scylla without dehumanizing Circe in the process.
All right, Section 3, the cost of heroism.
So how do we fairly analyze the most famous male hero in literature without just reducing him to a modern one-dimensional villain? To understand Odysseus fairly, we have to start with this ancient concept, kleos.
It literally means lasting fame, glory, and being remembered through public action. Odysseus isn't just driven by modern personal vanity. He's operating within an ancient moral system where public recognition is the ultimate defense against mortality. For them, it's how a mortal achieves immortality.
But look at how those traits transfer. The exact qualities that make Odysseus a legendary survivor in war, his action, his cunning, deception, assessing threats, those become incredibly destructive in domestic intimacy. The public heroism that saves an entire kingdom translates into private harm, manifesting as suspicion, a desperate need for control, and emotional distance back home.
The discussion focuses heavily on the psychological impact of prolonged war. When Odysseus finally returns to his brilliant wife Penelope and his son Telemachus, he can't simply flip a switch and turn off his survival instincts. He literally cannot surrender his strategic advantage. Intimacy requires a vulnerability that his trauma simply will not allow.
Dr. Bolen makes this devastating psychological observation. A person can lead thousands and fail one child. Heroic public excellence does not automatically transfer to private goodness. And yet, this doesn't mean Odysseus was never a hero, nor does it mean his private failures don't matter. It just means human beings are immensely, sometimes painfully complicated.
The mature, ambivalent position required to really understand Odysseus is this. We don't have to label him purely a hero or purely a villain. We can recognize that he was capable of extraordinary courage and extraordinary damage. We can admire the courage without converting it into moral perfection. Finally, Section 4. Read the full analysis.
We've covered some incredible ground today, but you know what's crazy? We've only covered the first 3 topics of this massive discussion. There are profoundly deep themes we haven't even touched on yet. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. As Circe experiences motherhood, her entire worldview shifts. She is faced with a massive decision regarding her immortality. Why would a goddess, possessing the one thing humans have literally spent millennia desiring, eternal life, choose to surrender it? What does it truly mean to choose a finite life, and how does motherhood force that psychological transformation?
If you want to dive into the answers to those questions, and I absolutely recommend you do, you need to read the rest of this brilliant analysis. Go visit imaginarytalks.com/Circe-Madeline-Miller-myth analysis to explore the final sections on motherhood, protection, and the shocking choice of mortality. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.